off. My name is Steve Wright. I'm president of AITP Atlanta. Thank you very much for joining us for our November chapter meeting. We have a fantastic discussion tonight. Eric Schrock, CTO of Jvion, is here. We're going to be diving pretty deep into a interesting topic around diversity and inclusion in everything from our own organizations, from a hiring practice, from artificial intelligence. It's going to be a very, very, very deep discussion on the whole thing. So really looking forward to diving into it. Before we get started, I did just want to take the opportunity to thank all of our members with AITP who's taken advantage of our membership and our current membership discount, good through the rest of the year for $40 a year. It will go up to $89 as of January 1st because we will be going back on site. We'll actually be getting together, shaking hands and breaking bread again, which I can't tell you how excited we are about that. AITP has been around since 1957, and we're very proud to have been a connector of people in the IT community, and we're looking forward to getting back to that. Not that virtual is bad, but it certainly doesn't replace the breaking of bread with one another. So we're looking forward to that. In any event, if you are interested in becoming a member, like I said, now is a great opportunity. It is $40 for an annual membership that will carry straight through to next year, and that gives you a deep discount on our events, on our face-to-face events, which we held at Atlanta Marriott Perimeter. And it will also give you access to our chapter event vault. So all of these events that we have with some great content will be pre-recorded and is behind a firewall. So if you become a member, you can go back and see these recordings from the previously recording events. So please consider becoming a member. For those of you who are not members, thank you very much for coming. We hope you appreciate, or we hope you enjoy the meeting. We'll consider becoming a member. Outside of that, the memberships are one thing, but our sponsors are another thing. That helps us drive our revenue and keep these meetings coming and delivering content to you each month. I would like to first thank our bronze sponsor, Transformation Lead. Georgette Fraser-Moore is the president of that. Thank you very much for that support. And then our silver sponsor is Synergis. Been a fantastic partner of ours, everything from our marketing of our events to, of course, some monetary support. So I'm just going to pass it over to Tracy Klein, the Executive Vice President of Strategy for Synergis.
Thank you, Steve. Of course, we are proud to be a sponsor with AITP and the importance really of providing a platform for technology education. I personally am interested in this evening's topic around incorporating diversity and inclusion as our industry seeks to broaden opportunities really to all individuals. I'm also, my personal support to organizations over the years around DE&I myself has certainly been a passion. Whether it's bringing women into technology or a variety of segments and cultures. It's really important to our industry. And of course, Synergis provides staff augmentation, RPO, and SOW services for organizations with specific talent needs in the IT and creative space. So we're always happy to be a part of this. Thank you, Steve.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the support, Tracy. Truly appreciate it. All right, I think enough of the preamble. Let's kind of get into the discussion. I'd like to welcome Eric Schrock, again, CTO of Jvion, who's going to be our discussion leader. We'll be having some open forum questions like I had mentioned before, but Eric, thank you again for volunteering your time. If you could just give us a little introduction, tell us a little bit about your background.
Absolutely, thanks for having me, Steve. So, as Steve said, I'm Eric Schrock. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Jvion. I have spent 20 plus years in software engineering. Over the last decade, really been focused on building and scaling teams in the world of data and enterprise software. And over the last 2 years have been at Jvion, which is a clinical AI company that helps prevent avoidable patient harm by not just understanding patients at risk for adverse outcomes, but understanding the drivers of those risks and providing clinicians interventions and recommendations to take them off that path. So I have spent a lot of years in leadership, and we'll talk a little bit about my DEI journey and why I'm here and why that's a topic that I'm passionate about. But that is me in a nutshell.
Excellent. Excellent. Yeah. And thanks for that, Eric. I've known Eric for quite a number of years. I think we just did the math. We connected over 6 years ago. And the topic of diversity has always been one that he and I revisit quite a few times. So I can't imagine somebody more perfect to be kind of talking about this in a wide open forum, in a very honest way too. I think that the diversity inclusion is a hot topic right now. But as we were kind of having a pre-conversation, it touches far more than just the initial conversation up front when we talk about hiring decisions and how do we make sure that we don't have our own internal biases when we're bringing people on. But it also covers how do we continue to drive that throughout our respective organizations. But it also touches into technology too. So when we had a gentleman, Jason Schlachter, had spoken on artificial intelligence and kind of opened up my eyes a little bit to some of those bias components that might get coded into artificial intelligence. So why don't we kind of kick off the topic there, Eric? And you had some pretty good thoughts about just even how that bias can even show up within artificial intelligence.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I think it's important to recognize, well, artificial intelligence is certainly at the edge, right, or at the leading edge of where we can encode that bias, where we can see those effects. Race and racism and institutional racism has always been present in our society. It morphs, it adapts, it changes, whether that's going through, slavery to, Jim Crow to, redlining to war on drugs to, voter ID laws. And so it's not something new, right? It's not something new that suddenly we have a institutional way or a new way of encoding biases, be it racism or gender or others. And, for anyone interested in the topic, I highly recommend Dr. Ruha Benjamin's book, Race After Technology. It's a really interesting read that will do this far more justice than I can. But to take an example from her book of just, how technology has encoded that bias before we ever get to AI. I thought one of the interesting examples that she started with was looking at photo film, right? So you think of photographic film, how can that be encoding racist ideas or perpetuating institutional racism in any way? Well, they're going to go and make photographic paper to expose, and to develop these photos. And when you're dealing with that physical paper, you need to make a choice about what colors, what tones are going to expose well, that are going to show up well in that photo. And, they have to necessarily make a choice because they're only going to ship one batch of paper. They want to save money and simplify things. So they choose a paper, they choose the methodologies that make white people and skin tones show up best in the photography. And so for decades, you have, people of dark colored skin, black colored skin who simply aren't getting the benefit out of the photography that home photographs that everyone else gets benefit. And that's something that we don't think about. We don't think about that choice. How did that get encoded in that system in a way that sort of perpetuates that? And I think as you get to AI, it just layers on that complexity. And one of the most pernicious things about AI is this view of neutrality. It's an algorithm. How can an algorithm be biased? It's not a person, it's not a human, it's just code. And the reality is the creators of those algorithms, the creators of those AIs, whether they want to intentionally or not, are baking into those systems, biases that then come out and affect real people, right? I mean, there's lots of cases of things like leveraging AI to predict criminal recidivism, right? Who is likely in a parole hearing to be likely to commit a crime once they're released? Well, that AI that's been trained and learning around how our society operates is amplifying the biases that exist in that environment. So it's looking and saying, well, Black people are more likely to be, committing a crime once they're released, which is obviously not true of any individual human, but is reflective of all kinds of social inequities, police brutality, carceral states, and things that are, much bigger problems in society that now that algorithm has taken and amplified and applied to real people. And so you have to be very careful as you think about AI, whether it's facial recognition, whether it's looking at criminal behavior or personal behavior. How does that actually affect individuals, and how is it? How do we understand that AI, and how do we mitigate its effects in an unbiased way?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a, I was thinking through this. I don't think there's certainly not a malicious intent behind coding in biases into artificial intelligence. But I think when there's unintentional biases and things that happen. I think we had Chris DeBellis talk on the topic of computer vision not too long ago. And it was interesting as he described the journey of how that technology was developed. It was really a matter of developing that facial recognition when it came to Caucasian faces, as opposed to working on creating that facial recognition when it came to all colors. And that has to be an intentionality in how you're creating and working through those technologies. So it's almost it's unintentional, but it's still there and it still needs to be addressed. What I find kind of more scary about things like this is when we start getting into other things and we start working through the data sets. And of course, data is king right now. AI, computer vision is all feeding this data into different things. And, Eric, you and I hadn't really talked too much about this, but what could some of those unintentional effects be from artificial intelligence or computer vision when we get into the healthcare space and we start talking about clinical outcomes? How has that kind of come about as far as some of these biases that you've seen, and what kind of negative effects have we seen from that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, AI in healthcare is a broad topic, right? It can cover everything from radiology imaging to protein synthesis to genetics, but when you hone in on the clinical application of AI, right? How are we informing decisions by clinicians and caregivers around rendering care? AI can be both a wonderful positive tool to shine a light and understand where health inequities and health disparities exist and how they can be used, but that can also, again, amplify and exacerbate those biases if they're not used in the correct way, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, if you look at the problem of understanding, how social determinants of health impact somebody's risk, it's not a simple black and white thing. So just to use an example, let's take, living in a food desert, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a classification. You can go get the census data. You can determine, oh, this is a food desert. I can happily live in a food desert because I have the privilege of having access to Instacart and Amazon Fresh and a car where I can drive to a grocery store. Someone who doesn't have that socioeconomic access, who has to rely on public transport or perhaps used to walk to their local grocery store, if that store closes, that food desert has a much bigger impact on them, right? And so you have to look at how do these factors interplay with each other, because ultimately those factors are guiding care, right? So where should we send our mobile mental health units? We partner with a food delivery service. How should we connect them to communities in need? Where should we invest in health education and health training sessions? And so what you want to be able to do is look at and understand how those different features or those different aspects interplay to really identify those people in need and those communities in need.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't do it well, again, you're going to amplify and exacerbate health inequities that might already exist, right? So you may have a affluent neighborhood that has a medium income at a high level. Say, great, this is a relatively affluent neighborhood, that doesn't mean that every block in that neighborhood is affluent, that there isn't affordable housing units that are supporting and enabling groups of lower socioeconomic status. And if you don't look for that, you are going to build in a bias, whether it's sort of simplifying things like, oh, high medium income is good, or race is bad, right? Oh, you live in a Black neighborhood. Obviously, your AI is hopefully not coded for that, right? Hopefully, you're not intentionally designing it. We're using race as a feature. But even if you don't do that, if you don't be purposeful about it, you can encode that in a way that then is perpetuating these, racial inequities and sort of racial driven healthcare disparities, because you are simplifying and amplifying those sort of those needs.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a good point on the amplification of that thing, and I think it's a lot of it can become unintentional. I'll steer it a little bit away from the technical side and the healthcare piece, and steer it a little bit more towards something that I do. I'm in the technology staffing business myself, and one of the things that we do as an organization is that has changed to be able to make sure that we weren't contributing to these unintentional hiring choices or even observations to even give somebody an opportunity. Something as simple as including a city that someone lives in or a zip code when we're presenting candidates to a hiring manager could create a bias, as opposed to just saying the general Atlanta market. There could be an area of town that would actually have a potential negative and some type of negative connotation to somebody who may or may not even notice that they're doing it. But by not including that information and just talking about a general background, that helps. So I kind of mentioned that just from an individual perspective, because I've always been one that believes that addressing these types of biases and diversity and inclusion starts with the individual and really how you do and act yourself, right? And trying to contribute to your own organization and changing some policies around that. And I've thought that I felt pretty good about myself for doing some of those things. But the conversation, Eric, that you and I were having last night when I talked about not unintentional bias, but
unconscious bias.
Thank you. Unconscious bias. I had just been through a seminar around that, and I was talking to a leader, and we were addressing it. And I'm like, wow, there are things about how I act and how I think that had uncovered a few things, and I felt really good that, hey, I'm now aware of this. But it's not just a matter of being aware of it, right? And I'm steering the conversation a little bit more towards the next line of topic, and that's that maybe it is around hiring decisions and how do we get that deeper into our individual organizations, and how we as employers and leaders in our companies can help drive that through. And Eric, I think you've done a phenomenal job inside your organization in addressing that. And maybe could you share a little bit about how you've addressed that and continue to address that within your culture?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, first, I think it's important to recognize, we have two white guys talking about diversity and inclusion here.
Yeah.
Right. And so what does that mean? Right. I'm not someone who can authentically represent the experiences and stories of marginalized groups. Right. I'm not going to be the best advocate for those communities and what they need. So, but what I can do is, as a person of privilege who is learning and imperfectly trying to apply those learnings, is sort of share what have I tried, what have I seen work, where have I seen success, and hopefully educate and give other people ideas about how to apply some of those to theirs. And over my DEI journey really began shortly after I became VP of engineering, and sort of starting to talk and listen to the women in engineering group that had sort of started grassroots within the organization, with the company, and sort of helping them amplify those voices. And I did a lot of the things that you were supposed to do. let's have unconscious bias training. Let's create ERGs. Let's have a diversity and inclusion council. Let's do the things that you're supposed to do when you create the programs.
Mm-hmm.
And what I realized as I went through those is, in many ways, they're performative. That doesn't mean they aren't earnest or people aren't genuinely desiring of change. But the key thing that just kept sticking with me is people didn't intrinsically understand these stories. They didn't understand the perspectives of these individuals. They might go to an unconscious bias training and see, oh, here's two resumes of, a woman and a man, and all we did was change the names and look how different the outcomes were. That's not the same as listening to someone articulate their lived experiences of racial trauma as a youth in their life, right? That's not the same as trying to listen and understand someone on the neurodiversity spectrum and how they struggle in their workplace environment. It's not the same as listening to someone who is transgender or has a non-binary gender identity articulate their challenges being themselves in a workplace. So the way I've tried to approach it as I go forward is really looking at two things. One, how do we bring those stories to each other, right? How do we bring those experiences? And two, then how do we, with intentionality, bake that into everything we do? And so that first one is really important because, again, you can have all the diversity you want. If you don't understand those lived experiences and internalize the systemic impediments that get in the way of those people being successful, then how the heck can you change anything, right? So there's lots of ways to do that. As an individual, you can go read some books, go follow diverse people on Twitter. I do not have any transgender Black friends, but I follow a whole heck of a lot of them on Twitter, right? There are great opportunities to bring those stories into your life. ERGs and affinity groups are good places for people to come together and share those stories without having the burden of having to explain or couch those. But you want to make sure that you have executive sponsorship and leadership there, not as a token, but as someone who's really participating and leaning in so they can help take some of those learnings and share them. So what we've done at Jvion is, we're a much smaller startup. We don't really have the size to have affinity groups and ERGs and the DEI council and some of the things that you are able to do at those larger companies. But what we could do is say, let's create a forum when we're bringing those stories to each other, to the table, right? Not a requirement. It's not training. It's not everybody must go through this. But every month we pick a topic that's ranges from, police brutality in the carceral state to socioeconomic inequities to neurodiversity, transgender, the list goes on. And we identify books, movies, podcasts, articles, things that people can read and understand. And then we come together and we talk about it. And it's a small thing, right? It's saying, well, that's not changing how you hire, right? That's not changing how a manager does X, Y, Z. But in my opinion, it's so foundational, right? It's so foundational that you can bring in these experiences and the stories that if you don't do that, if you're just trying to teach people like, this is how to, write a gender neutral job description. It's like, well, do you understand how not doing that impacts people, right? Do you understand what those experiences are? So it has to start there. And then from that, you can then build in, and now how do we change how we source, interview, hire, do performance reviews, treat each other in meetings, all the things that you need to do to then bake in some of those systemic change.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I'm kind of curious, when you open up a sensitive topic like that, just using your organization and your experience, how apt and how open were the people who joined, obviously just by attending these meetings, obviously they're interested in having the discussion, but it's a very difficult topic kind of to open up about and share some of those stories, especially if you've been a victim of some of those situations. Do you find that people are open to sharing those stories, or do you feel hesitant? And if so, how do you handle that hesitation inside your organization? It's got to be a sensitive thing to do.
Yeah. Well, and part of making it an optional thing, as you point out, is you're not required to come here, right? You're not required to come or share something you're not comfortable sharing, or participate in a discussion that you're not comfortable being a participant in, right? That's not the goal. And I've tried and seen other ways where you on one hand, you're like, well, you're preaching to the choir. Is that really helpful? But it is, because the choir is learning and growing, right? And they're sharing and they're applying that and they're evangelizing it. And at least in my opinion, it can be more effective than trying to preach to the uneducated, right? Or the people who don't want to be there. And so the discussions have been tense. When we talk about, one of the very first meetings we had was after a lot of the George Floyd protests, right? And in some ways was say motivated, but I distinctly remember in a sort of executive meeting or stand up. I don't really remember the context, and many of the people who were there are not at the company anymore. So this is sort of not talking about the current executive leadership, but it opened with people joking about being late to work because of the protests, right? And how, funny that was, and how, oh, we're in Alpharetta and it's a bunch of, white people protesting about Black Lives Matter. And I kind of broke down in a way that I never have in a professional setting, because you have folks who were ignoring the racial trauma and the lived experience of these people and focusing instead on the protesters and are they right or wrong, and in some ways making fun of them. And so one of the first topics we had in this Lunch and Learn group was, we watched 13th, which is by Ava DuVernay, is about, racism in the carceral state, police brutality. And that was a tough subject, a tough subject in that moment, a tough subject for many people there. The conversation, got heated at points. But if you can create that safe space and you can understand, we're all here to learn, that then you have folks who do open up, right, and talk about their experiences, and you ensure it's private. I'm not going to relay any of those conversations here as an example, right? Sure. They're great examples that we talked about. I'm not going to talk about them here, but that was a safe, private space to have that. So it's how you set it up. It's how you invite the right people. And honestly, it's important to be willing to talk about tough conversations. If folks are experiencing trauma in their life, it becomes a part of who they are. It becomes a part of their workspace, right? Like, one of the things that gets me super frustrated is when I read about some CEO, always a white guy, deciding that there shall be no political speech allowed at a company. And if you're Black or brown or trans or marginalized, your whole life is politicized. Like, you can't have a conversation where the majority will look at it and say, well, that is a political stance or a political speech. Like, no one's upset because they're having heated debates about tax policy, right? And like, it's because they're talking about, race and racial trauma, usually, not always, or they're talking about issues that are very much part of their lives. And who gets to decide what's political? Well, the white CEO boss gets to decide that's a political topic, right? If you come and talk about police brutality against Black people, that's a political topic. That's not allowed. And that is really frustrating because you're not creating that open environment. And you don't want to force people to talk about trauma. The flip side is also not true, right? Of like, hey, like, you're Black. Do you like, can you come and talk to the team about racial trauma? And it's like, no, don't do that, right? So it's about how do you create openness? How do you create opportunity? But doing it in a way that sort of invites the right discussions and the right safety for folks.
Yeah, super points, Eric. And part of the reason that I wanted to have this discussion with you in this particular forum was to really kind of maybe plant some seeds around some of the folks that are in here with how you've been able to accomplish that. And I think just due to the nature of the topic and the sensitivity of it, and I think your point about being willing to bring the discussion and the topic into the workplace, it does start with leaders. And I think in larger organizations, there's probably that much more challenging to open up discussions like this, just with the office politics that go on, and how do you create something along those lines? I guess,
Right.
have you heard of folks and folks and counterparts to yourself in larger organizations creating these types of forums inside these larger organizations? And if so, do you know how they've done it, and if there's been any kind of success rate or any kind of template for it that we can duplicate?
Yeah, I mean, look, you're always going to run the risk of running into the people who push back, right?
Yep.
So in a previous life as a company, as I was building and helping support some of these development of ERGs and affinity groups, there was pushback, right? There was pushback of why do we need to create a space for a particular group of folks? Why do they need a space? Why don't we all just, talk to each other? And it really made me understand sort of the privilege that you carry when you can sort of wield those words. Is you gave an example of, well, I'm Jewish, and if I were to join a company, I wanted to talk to other Jewish people, I would just send an email to the whole company being like, hey, any Jewish people want to get together to talk? And it's like, you have a lot of privilege in your role and your confidence to be able to state you're going to go do that. If you're, someone new to a company of 5,000 people or 10,000 people, are you going to go do that? If it's not because you're Jewish, but because you're trans and you're not out at work, are you going to go do that? And so if you create these spaces, it provides a place for people to share with each other, but also not have to continually explain or couch or they can be with folks who understand it. And so my recommendation, and as we went through that, is recognize that perspective, right? You don't want to say, okay, the goal here is to be exclusionary, right?
Mm-hmm.
And say, okay, the goal is to be inclusionary. This is not about excluding people. And at our ERGs, like I was in the LGBTQ ERG, like I do not have an LGBTQ identity of any kind. We would have folks who go to the women's ERG who were not women, and sort of tell that story of why it matters, right? This is not about, oh, we need to create these silos. It's about how do we give an employees a space where they can come and share themselves or share their stories that they might not be comfortable doing in other settings, but it's still very much part of who they are at work, right? If you're going to come to work after events in society, like police brutality or like others against Black people that affect you, you have the right to not talk about that at work. But oftentimes it can help to have other people to turn to, and creating some of those spaces is important. So my best advice is stay focused on, this is creating, at the end of the day, this is about creating a great space for employees, right? You want your employees to be successful, to learn, to grow, to want to be a part of this environment. and recognize maybe this is not something that you intrinsically understand, but this is important to many, and this is something we want to take forward. Another example is at that company, we had an event series called Sharing Your Stories, where individual employees would come and talk about their experiences. And it wasn't quite like the Mosaic Lunch and Learn, where it was like, here's a topic and we're going to pick a hard topic and we're going to dig into it. But people would talk about their past as immigrants, as women, coming up through their careers. And something like that is executives being like, oh no, don't create a forum where employees talk about their career paths. Like, who the heck is going to say no to that, right? That's like an obvious thing.
Right.
And you can start to use those forums and reach out to folks who have those stories that are more diverse. Like, don't line up 17 straight white guys to talk every week, right, about their awesome careers. So focus on employees, figure out how to pick the right kinds of things. Maybe it's ERGs, maybe it's a lunch and learn, maybe it's a share your story, maybe it's a book club, maybe it's a, favorite article, mailing list, right? There's all kinds of ways to go and create the opportunity to bring in those perspectives that are, and you have to figure out what are the right ones if you're encountering that resistance that are going to resonate and be your kind of foothold, right? Where you start to build from, and you build from there and you layer in and you add to it.
Oh, that's fantastic. It's great advice. Great. And before I kind of go on to the next piece, just for everybody's sake, and there's always acronyms that people don't know. What is ERG?
Employee Resource Group.
Thank you.
Affinity group is becoming more common, but Employee Resource Group is the common.
Gotcha. Yeah, I was just
also DEI.
DEI, yeah.
Diversity, equity, inclusion, right? And if you don't know what all those pieces mean, right? Diversity is about bringing diverse views to the table, but if those views aren't heard, respected, considered, then you don't actually have an inclusive environment. So you need to be diverse, you need to be inclusive, but you can be inclusive, but if you aren't changing the system, if you aren't modifying behaviors, you're still not creating more equitable outcomes, right? For example, if women historically have salary and pay disparities, right? You can have a woman join an organization at a pay level lower than a peer. You can say, well, our system only allows us to do 5% increments every year. Those two people, yeah, we're doing what we can in the system, and each of you are getting 5% every year. You're not addressing the pay inequity, right? You're not recognizing that the system itself is broken. And so if you don't, that's really what the E and the equity is in DEI is understanding, like, we have to change our behaviors. We have to change those systems to create more equitable outcomes. So we need diversity, and that's table stakes that you have diverse experiences. We have to create an inclusive environment, right? So that they're heard, they're listened to. There's a famous quote, I don't remember who said it, but if diversity is being invited to the party, then inclusion's being asked to dance, right?
Nice.
Imagine, like, great, you can be invited to the party, but if you're just sitting against the wall and nobody comes and wants to ask you to dance, then it's not the same. But it's that equity piece that I think is the hardest piece, because that's really, not that diversity and inclusion is easy, but equity is really where you have to fight for systemic change.
Absolutely, and I think it's really important. I mean, I circle it back to kind of the Great Resignation going on right now, and you and I touched on this a little bit in our pre-discussion. From where I sit, I work with a variety of organizations just throughout my 40-year career and talking to different companies and whatnot. And there's a number of organizations that promote diversity as part of their culture, but it seems to be eventually lip service at the end of the day, because they're not putting in those, they're not giving the tools, they're not giving the forum to have that truly interwoven into their organization, into their culture. And I think the evolution, and I look at the Great Resignation as an evolution in hiring, because it is very much about employment and people's individual situations, whether that's, we could boil it down to work from home, but that's not it. But I fully believe that there's plenty of people who are in jobs that they are just not happy with, because there are situations where there's not diversity, there's not equality, there's not inclusion going on. As much as you kind of have that fake facade up in the top, it does not happen, and people recognize that, and they're tired of it, and they've had an opportunity to be out, and they're invited to come back in. They're saying no. Right. It's just not worth it for me, and I think through the talent wars that we're all facing right now, there was a story that I was just astounded by, and I did a little bit more digging into it. The lack of service people and waiters and waitresses and bartenders are not going back to their jobs, because they're going out and they're studying technology to get a job in a company where they can break through some of those barriers, where they're kind of forced to stay in that from monetary. And this is giving them the chance to do the freedom, but also people with full-time jobs who are in organizations they weren't comfortable with, to go out and find an organization that truly does have that culture, that they strongly desire to have those type of open forums and those types of conversations. And I guess just on that topic of the Great Resignation, do you feel that some of this is part of that, or is that just kind of an observation from my side that might not, it's correlation versus causation?
No, I mean, it's absolutely a part of it, right? If you are in a toxic or unwelcoming environment, if you don't feel like you have a place to go or a way to find another opportunity, you will abide that environment much longer than you should, right? But if you feel like in the era of remote work, if in the era of the Great Resignation, that there is greater opportunities to find those that now that becomes a possible exit for you, right? And I think some of your points are spot on. There's a lot of DEI work that is performative, right? I mean, and I love unconscious bias training and the people, getting people to see that, but it is so often disconnected from action, right? You can have this great unconscious bias training, I don't know, let's pick performance reviews, right? So there is a lot of bias and stereotypes that will use different language to describe behaviors that are negative in some cases and positive in the other. So if a man is assertive, a woman is aggressive, a Black woman is angry, a Hispanic woman is crazy. And you learn about that in unconscious bias training, like, hey, like you have to think about what words you use, but that has to, sorry, my phone is ringing. I'll just let that go. I did not mute my phone.
That's all right.
You have to look at that and like, how does that integrate into your performance review? Can a manager say, you really get angry easily in meetings? If they can say that, then they're not actually identifying the underlying behaviors, right? They're not actually sitting back and saying, here's an example in this situation where this happened and this was the effect that it had on others, right? Because you can't have negative behaviors. You have to be able to talk about that, but you can't sort of like use these stereotypes and these generalizations. And so many companies will like have that training and not actually enforce it or coach it or teach it to their managers. And then like, what was the point? What was the point of that? You did that, you checked the box, you didn't integrate it into how you manage, how you hire, how you treat people. And the flip side is true, which is companies can be much more visible about their inclusion. So my last company, I had a manager leave and she joined another company. And I sort of asked, we were just talking. I was like, well, why did you choose that company? She said, well, it was very obvious that they cared about diversity and inclusion. She hadn't started there yet. I was like, well, tell me how. And so she sort of sent the little paper that is like, hey, here's the like what to expect, right, in your interview process. And it called out a lot of things that, here, dress yourself. We want you to be yourself. Here's the environment. And then it kept going. It's like, if you're a mother and you need breaks to be able to have access to a mother's room or to pump, like, let us know. And she's like, I'm a mother. I didn't think of that, right? And then I sort of shared it with groups. And, when we're in the LGBTQ ERG, they were sort of talking about, food supplements, right? And how if you have specific food needs, we'll accommodate you. And they called out, and I don't remember the details, but things that were associated with, transgender surgery I'm blanking on the words, but folks going through that process that are associated with hormone therapy and hormone replacement. And it was like, I never would have known that. Like, nobody would have known that, but clearly somebody was thinking through and talking to people and saying, what are the types of accommodations we should be making in this process, and making that visible to the people interviewing. So it's like a very clear case of, like, before she ever interviewed, right, she could see, wow, they've really thought this through. That feels like an environment. Now, it could be smoke and mirrors. That can happen. But it was very clear, to your point, if that's a positive attribute of your culture and your team and your environment, people want it. People are looking for it, right? They want to see, this is a place that will welcome me and is accommodating of different needs. It's really important.
Yeah, I mean, without a doubt. I'm going to turn it a little bit based off of a comment that Georgette had just thrown into the chat. And by the way, if anybody else has any other comments, please throw it into the chat, and we'll open it up to a couple of questions here in a minute. But Georgette had mentioned she found it interesting that a lot of other countries add belonging to DE&I in their programs, making it diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And I thought that was an interesting statement. And have you kind of crossed over that in your discussions, and how has that been applicable to what you guys are doing?
Yeah, I mean, we talk a lot about employee engagement. Like, that's the hot word that we talk about. Are you engaged? It's like, well, what does it mean to be engaged, right? What does it mean? And there's been a lot of studies, right? Like, for example, the Google, was it the Athena study? I'm drawing a blank. Anyway, they went through all this research and came out and said psychological safety, #1 predictor of high performing teams, right? That you're in an environment where you feel like you can take risks and you are supported, and that even if those risks don't work out, that you're not blamed or negatively sort of cast out from that. And it's not the same as belonging, right? But it's clearly an environment where you feel safe, right? And you feel like you can take that. Sometimes people talk about, being able to be your authentic self. Now, there's some double-edgedness there of, what does it really mean to be your authentic self? But if you look at, whether it's imposter syndrome, whether it's other cases where people feel like they need to be someone else, right? Like, this is one of the in my opinion, really valid critiques of sort of the lean in movement, of where kind of the essential thesis is, this is a man's world. Here are the types of things you need to do, or you can do, to be more effective and impactful in that environment, rather than saying, like, why the heck is this a man's world? Like, why are these the things that are valued? Why are these the attributes that get you promoted? Why is this behavior the right way to, make yourself advance in your career? And I think that's where the belonging comes in, right? We don't use that same word often. Some companies do. We talk about engagement. We talk about psychological safety. We talk about, being your authentic self. But at the end of the day, it's recognizing that you and your work are not separable things, right? It's not like, well, I can go to work and I can just, like, turn that part of my brain, my personality and my psyche off, and just be this other person, and that's okay with me. And so how do you create that space where someone feels like their authentic and to agree, that doesn't mean everybody has to be authentic they at work, but but whatever you choose to be, you're comfortable being that. That's yourself in that work environment is super important. And it's hard. We haven't talked a lot about neurodiversity, but there's a conference actually in Atlanta a few years ago I went to where that was the key topic, and there was a speaker there. And I highly recommend if you search for Jvion and BBC. He's a someone who works in tech and speaks and is does a bunch of accessibility work at there. But he really talks very concretely in a very real emotional way about how he is, as an autistic person, he is not defective, but that the environment disables him, right? He'll always need accommodations, but thinking through that it's actually our choices of the environment we create, the lights we choose, the open spaces we choose, the way we structure things that can have a disabling effect on people. And we don't think about that as, physical belonging. And I think back early in my career when people say, these are really harsh lights. And I was like new in my career and I was like, deal with it. Like that, and not in a negative way, but I'm just like, come on, man, they're lights. And
Right.
then you learn more about neurodiversity, you learn more about challenges that you have to understand, no, that's a real thing. And I think working from home has helped. A lot of people have more control over their home environment, right? They have more control, but it's not a panacea. Some people's home environments don't provide physical safety or psychological safety. Some of them have screaming children and distractions that are not good environments for them. And so it's not like there's one answer fits all, but you just have to always be thinking like, how do I create this physical space? How do I take this virtual meeting? How do I take this HR process and make it inclusive and amenable in a way that help people feel like they belong? And there's no magic bullet. And the work never ends.
It's hard work, right? It's people, it's emotions, it's sensitive things that are going on. And I was just thinking through in a little combination of some of the things you were talking about and Georgette's comment about other countries and how they're dealing with it, right? I see this as an evolution and a movement to really improve just lives and works. There's so many different positive outcomes that comes out of adopting these types of policies and changing your own internal environment inside the company. But I had the pleasure of being overseas for a couple of years, and where I was, there was, having these softer discussions about diversity and bias was so open. I mean, people were just obviously biased against different cultures and different colors and everything else. And I've heard this argument from some people that I've had this discussion with that, well, compared to other countries, we are so much further along inside of this. And I know that's not the same size for every country that's out there, but I hear comments like that, and it bothers me a little bit simply because there's so much more work that needs to get done. And it's almost like a cop-out that since other places are still so bad, we're doing good and we should pat ourselves on the shoulder. And there was a gentleman who popped in here I know very well. His name's Jerry Strickland. He just came back from Afghanistan. And I was really hoping he was still online because I was very curious to hear his comments on this topic. But it looks like he had to bail, and I'll have to have a conversation, a sideline conversation. But I think I applaud you, Eric, for the stuff that you're doing inside of Jvion, outside of the work environment, and helping promote this stuff, because I believe it's not only important to the individual and offering up these opportunities to people who haven't had these opportunities before. But I also believe it's kind of the key to these companies who are struggling with finding talent. And if they just realized that they'd open the door and work a little harder at diversity, inclusion, belonging, equity, these are not just buzzwords. These are things that need to be brought in, internalized, and made part of the organization. And not only from a leadership perspective, but the people inside the organization to adopt this stuff is just so important. And I just said that from a recap perspective, but I know we're coming up at the end of the 7 o'clock hour, but if there's anybody that has a comment, please toss it in the chat, throw up a reaction. We can open up your mic, but I guess, Eric, is there, you had any closing comments of your own? Just because we're coming up at the top of the hour.
I could talk about this.
I know you can.
For ages, right? But I do think it's important, the things I'd want people to leave with. One is, bring those stories into your life, right? And that can be a you decision. It doesn't have to be, I'm going to go implement these programs at work, right? They're great books, right? Find books. I mentioned, Dr. Ruha Benjamin. There's, Ibram X. Kendi. There's Jima Lowe. There's Minda Harts. There's all these books about, don't go and find the generic book about, how to be inclusive. Try to go find those authentic stories, right? Find them online, find them on Twitter, find them on YouTube, find them, wherever you can, because that's the foundation. And if you don't start listening, learning, understanding, anything you do is going to be at best secondhand, at worst sort of misinformed, right? So that's number one, like seek out those stories. And then number two is, be intentional about how you weave that into your actions and the actions of your team or your company, right? Don't just say, well, I read all this stuff and we should go have a DEI speaker come in for an hour and then we'll be good, right? It's like, don't do that. Not that there aren't great DEI speakers out there and that can be part of a program, but it's much more important to think about, how do I change behaviors, right? I just posted a Medium article today about job descriptions. And one of the things I always do is I don't let my team put a degree requirement in any job description, because there are so many paths into technology. You might have a different degree. You might have come through a boot camp. You might have come through certification. You might be self-taught. So many of those degrees are inaccessible due to socioeconomic inequity, due to personal hardships. And don't even go and put, Bachelor of Science in CS or equivalent. It's like, equivalent to what? Like, why is that important to you? Well, I really want people to have a foundational understanding of data structures and algorithms. Great, write that. Like, that sounds great. Like, have a foundational understanding of data structures and algorithms, right? So, that's an example of where, once you understand these things, once you understand the stories of people who struggle to have access to those types of degrees and institutions, once you understand how privileged and benefited the people who go to those institutions are in order to get into tech, then you can come back and be like, how am I perpetuating that? How am I contributing to that? And what could I do differently? And that's just a tiny little slice, but it's like, yeah, don't put degree requirements. PhD? Why PhD? Well, they've, done research. It's like, well, write that, like, led investigations in a research environment. Better description than PhD, because trust me, if someone's been, data scientist at Google for 20 years, you're not going to turn them down because they don't have a PhD. Like,
right.
Let's be honest. So, not quite closing arguments, but, seek out those stories, weave them into your lives, and if you can, the lives of others, and then be intentional about how you weave in changes to your behavior and the behaviors of your teams and organizations to improve the system.
Fantastic. Well stated. And Eric, thank you so much for your time. This is such an important topic. And AITP, we've been around since 1957 in the Atlanta chapter, 1953 as a national organization. And I imagine we've seen all bumps in the road and different people around this. But for us, we very typically in November will have a mingle jingle event and kind of just celebrate the fun. And I do wish everybody the best of holiday cheer. But as you're going through this, I felt that this was such an important topic to get out, and the timing to have Eric come in and speak and give an overview around here and give us a little food for thought as we do go into the holidays and think through how we can not only improve our lives and the lives of others and the lives that we work with. I think it's an important message and certainly something to go into the holidays with. So, Eric, thank you so much for your time. Truly appreciate it. Everyone, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Please, hope you consider becoming a member of AITP. Now's a great time to join and become a member at $40 a year. January 1st, it's going to revert back to the 89. And again, thank you very much, Eric. We will talk to you soon.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thanks, everyone. And thanks to the sponsors for making it possible.
Yeah. You beat me to the punch. Dang it.
There you go.
Transformation Lead and Synergist, thank you so much. All right. We'll talk soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Have
Bye.
a good night. Bye-bye.